Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back to everybody who's joined us for previous talks, and welcome if you're new especially. Today is the last talk in our series of speakers. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, but before I do, I would like to draw your attention to our code of conduct that helps us run these events smoothly with as much or at least resistance as possible. So please take a moment to have a look at this. Okay, and today our last speaker is Dr. Jansen Smith, who is a conservation paleobiologist whose research focuses on using lessons from the past to guide modern conservation practices. For example, he's worked in the Colorado River estuary, assessing changes in the snail and clam communities in responses to damming and water diversions on the Colorado River over the 20th century. Jansen currently works at Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen-Nuremberg in Germany as a postdoc on the Paleosynthesis project, which he's going to talk to us more about today. Over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Emma, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, so everybody should be able to see the screen now.
Yep, all set.
All right, so as Emma said, I'm going to talk about the Big Questions in Paleontology project, and I would like to hone in on the first word of the title here, as this is preliminary. The project itself is still ongoing, as I'll talk about. So this is all subject to change, but it's just kind of observations of what's happened so far. I'd like to also acknowledge our funders. So the Paleosynthesis project itself, of which the Big Questions project is a part, was funded by the Volkswagen Foundation in their Rare Subject Initiative. And that's to the PIs Wolfgang Kiesling and Manuel Steinbauer. So that is where my funding comes from to help run this project. I'd also like to extend thank yous to everybody who's participated in the project so far. More than 200 people contributed questions to the project, coming from many countries around the world, as we'll see here. Of those 200, around 175 have continued to work on the project in working groups, and that number fluctuates some as people, so a few people have joined a little late, a few people have had to lead the project. A huge thank you also to the 24 or so group leaders who have made the project possible. I'll talk a little bit more about them, but they have been absolutely critical to the success of the project. And also to Barbara, who's been very important for logistical support and helping the entire project, Paleosynthesis project, move forward. Thanks also to Nuseba and Emma for organizing this fantastic event, and to the speakers so far. It's been a fantastic experience, and I will try to live up to the high standard that's been set. Okay, I want to just touch on as well what this talk will not be, because the Big Questions project involves around 175 people. This is very much not a presentation of the results of that project. That's going to be coming later down the road. It'll probably be sometime in June before we're ready to do that. This is also not a conclusive statement on best practices. This is just some observations from running a large project that might have bearing for people who are running similar large-scale projects in the future, particularly when there are many people from many places involved. So what this talk will try to be is a presentation of observations from an organizational perspective. So this will be largely my opinions. Also, we recently ran a survey for Big Questions participants, so some of that input will be incorporated here as well. For the most part, this is exploratory in the strategies that we've tried. We'll comment a little bit on what's been effective so far, and then on where there is opportunity for improvement. And throughout this, I'd also like to acknowledge my positionality as a cis hetero white man who's a native English speaker from the United States who lives and works in Germany. That positionality has likely impacted my experience as a leader in this project as it has in my career. So just something to have in mind as I go through. Okay, so what is the Big Questions project? The project we're running was inspired by some other efforts that have occurred. One of the most prominent being the, I'm just going to pointer. The 100 questions of importance to conservation of global biological diversity by Sutherland et al. And subsequent work by the Sutherland group. There's also been a similar effort in paleontology by Seddon et al. Specific to paleoecology. So these were the inspiration for the work we're doing to try to identify these overarching questions to guide our research. Now, the effort to do this was originally planned to be in workshops and in smaller in-person working groups. But of course, the pandemic changed everything as it has in the last couple of years. So we've shifted to an entirely virtual format, which has some pros and cons, as we'll see, but is a different format to these other efforts where they've largely met in person. So this is also to say that this is very much an experiment. There we go. This is very much an experiment. So everything we're trying here, as far as I'm aware, hasn't really been done on this scale. So if you have input on what you're seeing me present, or I know several of the people in attendance have actually participated in the project, feel free to chime in during the Q&A at the end. So why do we do a big questions project? Well, there are several reasons. The first being it's an opportunity to evaluate the basis of the discipline. So where are we at as a field? We can use that then to help us define research priorities, which we can use in turn to motivate funding. So the list of questions that we'll develop could be developed into a white paper as well, which can be then submitted to funding agencies to help motivate more funding for the field of paleontology in general. It can also facilitate strategic planning for individual researchers so that they can develop research agendas that are in line with what the community thinks is important, which can help them contribute to publication success and career success, and that can help strengthen the field itself. And one of the really key things that we're going to hone on, or have attempted to hone in here in this project, is to increase the exchange of ideas between groups of paleontologists. We often work in isolation with little communication between groups. So one of the major focuses here was to get people together in the same room, really to engage in these kind of more informal communications, which can be really critical for idea generation and just for cohesion as a whole. So the project has a couple objectives. The first big objective here is to develop a community-based vision to guide research in paleontology in the years ahead. And of equal importance, the aim of this project is and is to increase global collaboration, to build stronger networks between paleontologists, and then ultimately to generate new ideas for the field of paleontology. And then the intended output here is an open access publication, which will include all of the approximately 175 participants as co-authors. And this is all intended to really just be a starting point. This project, we hope, will continue to have spin-offs and to have more ideation coming from it in the years ahead. We're focused specifically on defining the questions, not on answering them. So that work lays ahead. Now you might be wondering, what exactly is a big question? It's kind of a nebulous concept. So for this, we drew some guidance from the Sutherland et al. Paper, as that's one of the first and largest papers. They have, I believe, 7 criteria. The first is that a big question addresses important gaps in the knowledge. So it's something we don't know yet. It's more than just a topic area. So for instance, in paleontology, we know climate change is important, but we want to actually ask specific questions about climate change research. Of course, it has to be answerable through a realistic research design so that we can actually address the question at some point. Related to that, it needs to have a spatial and temporal scale that can be addressed. And we want it to have a factual answer so that it's not a value judgment. So it's data-driven. We also want it to be broadly applicable. So not just a situational answer or something that you can answer with, it depends. And the last point here is that it's something that will hopefully be answerable with something more complex than just a yes or no answer. A yes or no answer may be part of the explanation, but hopefully the question itself is inviting more thought and more thought, I guess, in what that response would be. So the project overview, I'm going to just run through quickly what we've actually done on the project before I tell you what we've tried to do in running it, so that you have a sense of what the project is. So the first step in this overarching process is to collect questions. So the community was invited to submit those at multiple points throughout the last couple of years. We then form a team of experts. And this is again where our project differs from previous efforts. So for us, we said anybody who wants to participate in this effort is welcome to do so. It doesn't matter where you are, what your expertise is. Even if you're an ecologist, an archaeologist, I know we have people with those expertises involved, and they've really served to enrich the process. Past efforts have been by invitation or by selection, which tends to restrict the number of persons involved and perhaps bias that towards certain countries, as we'll see here in just a minute. The next step is for those team of experts to evaluate questions, whether that's, first independently. So everybody was able to view the questions, and then after they'd viewed them and evaluated themselves, they then collectively worked in teams to refine the questions. And that's the last step. And it looks like this is just the fourth of 4 steps, but revising the questions is actually the major component of the project. And that's essentially what I will be spending the rest of the time talking about, where we get the experts together in the same space, and then they are building consensus and revising questions. So I'm going to go through just a few of these key steps with a few details, again, just so you have an understanding of what the process was. So first, we wanted to solicit those questions and participation in the project. We targeted this as a 2-month window, but it had actually taken much longer, as we'll see. After having the questions and our participants, we then established topic-specific working groups, which you can see here on the right side of the screen. These groups are, they reflect the questions that came in, and then also major topics that have existed traditionally in paleontology. From there, we then put participants into the working groups. So each participant got to provide their top 5 choices for working groups with the ranked list. And actually, it worked out surprisingly well. Everybody either got their first or second choice for working group, which was really nice. And then each group had 1 to 3 leaders. And those leaders were absolutely critical, as I said already, to the way this project has unfolded. And the leaders themselves were on a volunteer basis. So anybody participating could indicate that they would like to be a leader. I believe we had about 40 people who said they'd be willing to do so. And then they were selected to kind of optimize across a variety of factors. So we wanted people to lead a group that was one of their top preferences. So they had the expertise to lead it. We looked at gender balance, and then we also looked at career stage and where people were coming from in terms of country. So we tried to make the leadership team as diverse and representative as we possibly could. So from there, then, the working groups were intended to meet for about 3 or 4 months, with each of these 12 groups producing approximately 10 preliminary questions. And those 10 preliminary questions were based on the questions that were fitted into the working group topics, which could be up to 85 questions per topic. There were also kind of 2 special groups here labeled as fundamental issues and looking inward and outward. And these groups were a little different. These are focused more on the actual practice of paleontology. That's the fundamental issues. And then looking inward and outwards was more specifically focused on diversity, equitability, justice, and inclusion. And again, kind of somewhat different from previous efforts, we're including these 2 groups and their questions on equal footing to the scientific topics to reflect their importance in how we do our work. So anybody was welcome to participate in those groups. So everybody got to be in one of the 10 scientific groups, and then also could opt in to be in one of those other groups if they would like. So the theoretical next step, which we are about to start, is the whole group review of preliminary questions, where everybody in the project will review all of the questions that have been submitted. And then based on feedback from the entire group of participants, we'll take some time to revise the questions into a final list, and then that will go into a manuscript. So it's a long process, which we have optimistically portrayed here. You can see basically a variety of those steps I've just described here on the left, and a timeline ranging from the start of this year to the end of this year. So we are here in the first week of December. Unfortunately, we are not here at the manuscript development phase. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. We've had to make some changes and adjustments as we've progressed through the project. So now I'm going to go into kind of 4 major challenges that have occurred running the project. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've done, and then I'll wrap up by talking about some kind of overarching takeaways. So challenge number 1 here is participation. So who is involved in the project? Do we actually achieve this representation of people from around the world? Just for context, I'd like to show what has happened in the 2 efforts that we've talked about so far, the Sutherland paper and the Sutton paper. So the Sutherland paper had 44 authors. They were distributed amongst 13 countries, and predominantly they came from the United Kingdom and then from the United States, with a few representatives from other continents. If you've been a part of the speaker series so far, you might think that this looks familiar. It does. I encourage you to revisit Dr. Nunez's talk if you'd like to hear more about the topic. But we see the pattern that has played out in science in general. Moving to the paleontologically specific project, this paper had 69 authors, again, 13 countries represented, and again, a heavy dominance in the United Kingdom, and then the United States was the next most highly represented country. And this also did not include any authors by academic affiliation in Asia or South America. Okay, so how did we approach this? We tried to garner participation through multiple solicitations. So the first solicitation was in the summer of 2020 and was primarily done through listservs like PaleoNet and the Conservation Paleobiology Network. We wanted to get a little bit more participation, so we ran another solicitation over the winter. And again, we used the listservs, but we also took advantage of social media this time, particularly platforms like Twitter and Facebook, where we could directly interact with major societies. That gave us about 100 participants, and at that point, we felt pretty good. We thought we had a good representation. So we had our first whole team meeting in March 1st of 2020. And during that meeting, we were talking about who was involved so far, and it became apparent that we were not, in fact, representing the entire community. So the approximately 50 people in attendance had essentially a vote. Everybody got to voice their opinion if they wanted to, and we decided that we would open another solicitation to try to increase our representation. So we used some of the same techniques here in the spring of 2021, using social media again, but the major difference here was using word of mouth. And we particularly encouraged people to invite colleagues from places that were not already highly represented in our team. These were places like the United States and the United Kingdom again. We also developed solicitations in other languages. Several members of the Big Questions team volunteered to do these translations, which gave us versions in Chinese, French, and Spanish, which were cumulatively used 18 times. And this solicitation brought us to approximately 175 total participants. So we can look at what that means in terms of global representation. And there's good news and there's not so good news here. The good news is that we have about 34 countries represented so far. The bad news is that we do still see if we consider this as a person-to-person basis, that there's still a dominance of people from places like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, where we are running the project from. Compared to the other projects, this looks quite good. We have more representation from other continents, but of course, this is not, this is perhaps an improvement, but it's not where we want to be. We would like this to be more representative still. So it's very much a work in progress and something to be improved on. One thing to note is that this only represents 89 respondents so far. So we recently sent out a survey for feedback, and approximately half of the team has responded. So this will likely change, although the proportions will probably stay similar. Relatedly, communication has been one of the other challenges to address. I'll break this into two parts. The first being languages. So as I mentioned already, to try to address the dominance historically of English in the field, we did draft these solicitations and surveys to be in Chinese, French, and Spanish. And this was, again, based on a volunteer effort by participants. So in the future, it would be great to have these from the outset and to have, of course, more languages if we could. We have had to rely on English as the shared common language for essentially all other project communications from there, in part because I only really speak English myself. So that's one of the recommendations we'd have, is to have a multilingual leadership team in the future. We will have an opportunity for exchange in different languages in the next phase of our project. So as people are reviewing questions from other groups, I will be holding what I'm calling office hours, where people can drop into a Zoom room, and we will also dedicate specific times to other languages. Spanish is a leading candidate, as I believe that is the second most commonly spoken language by people in the project. And we'd also like to make this the output available in multiple languages. One option here that we saw with the Sutherland paper is that they actually include a supplemental version that is in another language. So that's an option, and it's something that we're going to explore moving forward. So communication, in addition to the language we speak, we've tried to use multiple platforms to communicate effectively with everybody involved. The most intuitive way to do that is through email. So I send lots of large emails to the group. Group leaders have coordinated through email. And this is perhaps the most traditional way to communicate deadlines, to send links for surveys and things like that. The Google Drive platform has also been very valuable. In particular, we've used Google Forms because it's a free service. So a lot of our surveys have been conducted on forms. We can also use Google Docs here to do collaborative editing of documents. There are some issues though. Google itself is not available in all countries. So some participants were not able to access the Google platform. So we did provide them Excel versions in most cases, or found alternatives. But depending on where people were coming from in terms of country or where they were working, Google Drive was very effective. Slack was intended to encourage more discussion kind of asynchronously, so that people could chime in to and share ideas when they had the time. This has been, it's been met with mixed reviews. Not everybody's familiar with Slack, which has been a bit of a barrier, but those who do use Slack more regularly have enjoyed it, I believe. Some of the working groups have also had good success with the Slack platform. We also try to use more collaborative workspaces like Miro. This is just one of several that exist. Again, these are a free service so that nobody has to pay for subscriptions and things like that. Miro allows you to do mental mapping, you can do post-it notes, all sorts of tools that multiple people can log into and use at the same time. So again, just trying to provide an option for people to work with. And of course, as has become ubiquitous in the pandemic era, we did regularly hold Zoom meetings, a few times as a large group. A few times I would meet with working group leaders to coordinate, to give them information. And then most of the working group meetings have also taken advantage of Zoom when possible. So we've tried multiple strategies. Kind of the big takeaway here, I think, from most people was that maybe less might be more. So Slack had mixed reviews. Some people really liked it, some didn't. Some people really didn't like Miro. Again, I think people were not always familiar with that platform, so it required more effort to become familiar with it, which created a barrier to participation. So the top three perhaps would be email, the Drive platform, and then Zoom for video communication. The next challenge here is workflow. And this is largely related to time zones. We, I think, had just about every time zone in the world represented in the project. So if you're trying to find a time to meet, it is not easy. And I think that's probably the biggest obstacle to how the project has run, is just trying to find a time for everybody to participate. So there have been multiple approaches used to try to address this. They fall into two general categories here: synchronous, so same time, and asynchronous. The synchronous approaches have been conducted in large part by the group leaders. And again, I have to really commend the group leaders for their effort here. They went above and beyond to make sure people could participate. To do that, the synchronous approaches typically used Zoom again for the meetings, used Drive to do things like work in the same document at the same time. And a few groups also used the Miro platform to brainstorm and share ideas that way. Where the group leaders really, I think, were fantastic is in holding multiple subgroup meetings. So in some cases, there would be multiple meetings for a single working group in a single day, perhaps at 8 a.m. and then 6 p.m. So that people could chime in from around the world. Or in some cases, that would be spread out during the week. So it was a big effort from the group leaders to do that. Some more traditional techniques would be like using breakout rooms and Zoom meetings to break groups into smaller sizes, so discussion could be contributed to by all members, not just a few. Again, already talked about mental mapping in Miro, and then editing in Google Docs. But I think the biggest and most successful strategy here was the multiple subgroup meetings, which made time zones a little bit more manageable, but it did increase the burden on the working group leaders. Asynchronous approaches, I think, were very well received in general. Not all of them, of course, or not every one of those options by every person involved. As you're all probably aware, no one thing seems to work perfectly for everybody. Something that people did comment on in the feedback form was that ranking questions and using forms was successful. Again, working in the actual smaller working groups where there are about 15 people, there were good uses of Slack where everybody had buy-in to use that platform. But from a project-wide perspective, Slack was not always as successful. And again, some of these things like Google and Miro allow both synchronous and asynchronous options so that people can come in after a group has met and then see what has been done and contribute still. So a mixture of approaches that have been used. And of course, emails, always emails. So the last obstacle that I'm going to talk about here is just project cohesion. How do we keep a project like this moving forward? Everybody's busy. There's never enough time, and there are quite literally rabbit holes to be run down. So keeping everybody moving forward has been, perhaps for me, one of the biggest logistical challenges. And as I already teased earlier, our original timeline here did not hold up, I think, by the end of April. So this was developed in the end of February in preparation for the meeting in March. We, of course, decided to do another solicitation, so we had to update our timeline. So optimistically added 2 months, which basically allowed us to do this third solicitation. Now, that also has not proved tenable. The working group meetings they've taken more time. And that's okay. It's been hard to get everybody to be able to involve. Personally, I feel like my brain and my daily schedule looks a bit like this. People have many projects and many priorities. So, for me, this project is, of course, priority number one. For group leaders, it's probably a high-ranking priority. But for every participant, they have their own research agendas. So we've tried to be flexible and extend timelines so that we can get good contributions from everybody. And of course, I'd like to also acknowledge that this has been going on through a pandemic. Numerous people in the project have communicated that they've had to sit out because they've had COVID and had to recover. There's of course childcare issues, virtual teaching, you name it, a variety of obstacles. So we've tried to be as flexible as possible on scheduling, which has had its benefits in that we can keep everybody more involved, but it has contributed to perhaps a lack of cohesion in the project to some extent, as the process has been drawn out over more and more time. So we've had several strategies to deal with this, to try to keep everybody on the same page, to keep everybody communicating. And as I've mentioned, email has been a popular choice. So I send a lot of emails. Every time we know there's going to be a delay, I try to send an email to the group to let them know what the updated timeline is, that a delay has occurred, and just to share that information so that everybody hopefully has been communicated with. The other strategy was to develop a website that hosts all of the information about the Big Questions project. So we have project details with the timeline. All of my email communications are here, working groups, additional resources, code of conduct, and contact information. So we tried to develop a centralized place where people could go to find information if they needed it. And this is just something that's happened in the last 10 days or so. We've also opened a feedback opportunity for participants to let us know what's working. This also was motivated by giving this talk so that I could use it to give the talk. But this is also timely as we are about to transition to the next phase of the project this week as well. So we'll be incorporating this feedback into the process. And this is a reminder to me to acknowledge that a lot of the ideas I'm sharing are a mixture of mine and those shared in the feedback form. So thank you to those of the project participants who have also shared that feedback so far. Okay, so kind of gonna wrap it up here with starting with phrases on repeat, quite literally things I feel like I say to myself in the mirror. Expect delays. As we've seen, schedules are complicated, delays are inevitable. So trying to be patient and to respect that has been an ongoing process, just again, to try to be empathetic with situations that each of our 175 participants is experiencing. So with that, we try to find ways to be flexible and then to build them into the project itself, which is again, one of the reasons for the feedback form that we've just sent out. We also have a ton of expertise from people with a wide range of backgrounds. So trying to take advantage of that, it's really a strength of a project with a group of this size. There's an expert in just about everything that we need. So trying to make sure everybody has a voice to express that has been really important. Also, we try to be flexible, but no sometimes has to be the answer, but just saying no is not enough. Trying to give explanations has always been appreciated, and is something that I try to do so that everybody again feels like they're communicated with, and that we can make this as transparent as possible as a process. And perhaps an underlying theme here is communication. Trying to communicate early and often, it's absolutely essential to keep the project moving forward. So go into a quick summary here of what was effective. I think the asynchronous options were perhaps most successful in that it enabled a wide range of people to participate that wouldn't otherwise have been able to in a project like this. So using things like forms and surveys and collaborative documents. Topic-specific working groups were well received. This made things more manageable for people as it took us from 175 people to 15-person groups. And the group leaders, like again, I can't stress enough, the group leaders have been fantastic in running those groups. Another point that was brought up in the survey several times was an appreciation for the inclusion of paleontologists at all career stages. So we have everybody from undergraduate students to folks who have retired, and they've been interacting in the same space, exchanging ideas, and that's been really valuable. Virtual meetings, similar to the asynchronous options, being virtual instead of in person has allowed us to make this a large project. If you think of a project like this that's been run in the past, usually they're in person. And if you're having an in-person meeting, that has a huge financial cost, and it does restrict the number of people you can have involved. So being virtual has been beneficial in that sense. We are on our way to identifying major research topics. This is to be continued, but we're getting there. So going back to our project objectives, we can think about if this project has actually increased global collaboration, built stronger networks, and led to new ideas. I would argue that it has, but there's a lot more work to be done. And this is a completely separate project, the diversity dynamics in crisis and paleontology, but there's a really nice synergy that we can learn from, and I'm excited to see the crossovers that can occur between these projects. The first opportunity for that is in including scientists outside of Europe and the United States. This is the biggest opportunity for improvement, and something that being involved with this speaker series has been absolutely incredible for, is learning different approaches. And I'm really excited to see what will come out of this under the guidance of Nuseba and Dema. I mentioned already that a multilingual and multinational leadership team would be valuable for an effort like this in the future. This would help spread the coordination load, but also would, I think, facilitate better inclusion. Retaining and increasing buy-in from each participant would also help. There are many reasons why people haven't been able to be as engaged as they might like, or as I might like. Of course, prioritization is one of those things. But finding ways to keep everybody engaged there will always be room for improvement there. I need to personally work on balancing structure and flexibility. Again, from the feedback form, I think people would appreciate a little bit more top-down structure. The flexibility has been good in some ways, but there needs to be a fine balance there between those two. And although communication has gone relatively well, there's always room for more, again. And something that came from the feedback form is that there are oftentimes people looking for information, and it is often available on the website, but they didn't know where to find it. So just communicating where information can be found would be very valuable. And there also has been a desire for more interaction between working groups, particularly synchronous discussion and networking. I think a lot of people were very excited to interact across groups, to exchange with paleontologists around the world. They just want more of it, which is really fantastic, and I think a positive takeaway from this. So lots of room for improvement, but the project's not over. So that's the exciting thing of doing this now. We can actually incorporate some of that feedback. So this is just one piece of the puzzle, as we said. We still have a lot of work to do to even start to try to answer these questions. So that'll be an exciting next step. After we've wrapped up the Big Questions project itself, we will do a reflective piece about the process. So expanding on the ideas I've shared here, getting more input from group leaders and project participants. Of course, we have this great synergy with the DDCP project, which I've already mentioned, which will be exciting to explore moving forward with participation from all of you, of course. And just a quick advertisement. So I'm a postdoc on the paleosynthesis project, and we will be advertising for a new postdoc next spring. So keep an eye out if this is something that you think you'd enjoy working on. We will be looking for my replacement soon. With that, here's a bunch of information on where you can find more information, how you can contact us. I'm happy to drop links into the chat as well. For the paleosynthesis project in general, you can find us at PalSynth on Twitter or on the website. If you're curious, you can explore the Big Questions website. I do typically handle the Twitter for the paleosynthesis, but you can also find me on my personal Twitter. And a quick blurb for the next up in our series, we have our roundtable discussion on Friday. So please do be there for that. And if you've missed a talk, you can find those on YouTube. And again, I'll drop that link into the chat for you all. So with that, thank you all for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you so much, Jansen. It was a wonderful way to end with a project in progress. I've got some great questions ranging from very specific to quite broad ones. So anybody who's dying to ask a question, please drop it into the chat or into the Q&A box. I think I better get started.
Right. I will try to be brief in my answers, but
this one is quite specific. Can you comment or provide any information on the demographics of those who volunteer to be team leaders?
I can. So yeah, there's so much more information. If anybody's really interested in diving into this information, do reach out to me. I would be more than happy to Yeah, about 40 people volunteered, approximately 3-to-1 male to female. Career stages were leaned towards early career. And again, we're predominantly from the United States, but I think ultimately we were able to balance things so that I think the gender split is approximately even. There is kind of reflecting the broad demographics of the project. There are slightly more project leads who are from the US, but we do have, I think we have folks from like pretty much around the world for group leaders. So we were able to get better representation amongst the group leaders than we were in the project itself in terms of distribution. But again, there's room for improvement.
Cool. I was trying to order them in terms of like how broad they were, but I'm just going to go for it. Do you think your project worked better because of all the measures you took to be more inclusive, despite delays, etc.? How do you think it would have worked out if you hadn't done this?
I think, oh, that's such a good question. I think, yeah, being flexible like that has helped keep people on board, and it's helped keep representation for sure. If we had just kind of steamrolled ahead, we would lose people who are disproportionately affected by things during the pandemic. So people responsible for childcare and things like that. And I think we would probably have gone back to a few loud voices who were most engaged in the project, which of course the people who are most engaged are going to probably have the biggest voice in this project. But extending that has allowed people to come in and come out. So I think it has been relatively worthwhile, even if it's made a 6-month delay.
Related to what you mentioned at the end about flexibility, do you think that the extended timeline of the project is part of the reason that the participation in it is limited? Would a shorter or a longer project work in your experience?
Sorry, could you say it one more time?
I'll read it out exactly how it was written.
Okay.
Do you think that the extended timeline is part of the reason that participation, I don't know why I'm stumbling over that word, in the project is limited?
It could be. I mean, most of the solicitation for participation was pretty focused. So that phase of the project was well constrained, particularly the effort in March. I think we set aside 6 weeks and really tried to get people on board at that point. So if anything, I don't think that's been a huge factor in who participated. I think the biggest factor would be the networks that we've used. Actually, I was just reading the the paper I'm publishing in English by Martin Nunez and his team. And they mentioned that people who have access to colleagues who speak English are disproportionately going to be able to publish in English-speaking journals because of the language barrier. So I wonder if we didn't have some of that same effect where by using word of mouth from predominantly English-speaking colleagues, we hit the same networks that were already represented there. So understanding how to connect with people in these other countries would be more valuable. So we found Facebook groups, like Heal Latinas. We found basically anybody talking about paleo on Twitter or Facebook, we tried to hit, but that of course biases who participates in a different way. So there's, again, a lot of room for improvement, but love to hear ideas too if people have them.
That was a really important point about how people connect through English-speaking colleagues. Yeah. This is quite an important question, and I think you have something to say about it. Do you feel that the many virtual or online options, for example, Zoom, that many people are now much more used to using than before the pandemic, might have actually improved or benefited the representation for the project, because in-person meetings on a global scale are very hard or even impossible due to cost, visas, and CO2 impact? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's I guess like a silver lining, I guess. I don't know if I want to use that phrase even, but yeah, I think people are much more familiar with Zoom and just working virtually than they were 2 years ago. So I think people were a lot more comfortable working in that setting, and it's definitely contributed to this project. And there's just no way, you know, I think with the other 2 papers I talked about, there was like, you know, 45 to 65 participants And even that, if you budget a couple $1,000s per person, you're talking about $250,000 really fast. And we just don't have that money a lot of times. So virtual definitely has its positives.
Related to that question, how much do you think the pandemic played a role in shaping the project? And would it have looked differently if you weren't using a virtual side of things, if you were doing it mostly in person?
Yeah, I think the original idea was probably to just focus on what amounted to the topic of one working group. So say climate change or conservation paleobiology, and then to really hone in on the questions related to that topic. So it allowed us to kind of broaden the topical area and then also the participation. And I think as much as anything, the funding would have been a constraint on the smaller working groups. There's just, we got the Volkswagen Foundation gave us a lot of money to do this fantastic work, but there's always a limit.
Yeah. There's some thoughts in the chat as well about this. I think everybody's agreeing with you. I think this is our, maybe second to last question. At this stage, what do you expect the results to be? I mean, what do you think they will be the uses and usefulnesses of the results?
So yeah, we're this week, I will be sending out the preliminary list to the entire team. So we have around 100 questions across the 12 different groups. So hopefully they can be a conversation point for people to kind of react to as much as anything. It's 175 people, but it's still not the entire community. So there's a lot of room to react. So as much as anything, I hope it starts a discussion about what these major topics are. We do want to, so we want to have this be a publication so that it is a professionally meaningful thing that people can use. But we would also like to develop from it kind of white papers for funders so that we can generate more funding for paleontology in general. And that's where having multiple languages for that document in particular would be valuable, so that paleontologists in the community can use that to go to funding agencies to advocate for more money, saying, hey, look, the global community of paleontologists thinks this is important. Let's make it happen. The other output that I've only talked briefly about, but or topic I guess I'll mention is the looking inward network groups and the fundamental issues groups. Having those, I think, is very unique compared to some of the other projects, in that we're going to be putting kind of the like the justice, diversity, and inclusion issues front and center with the scientific questions. And not everybody's going to like that. But as much as anything, we're going to put it at the forefront, and hopefully it'll create awareness and conversation, and then ultimately, hopefully, action building from that.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you for all of that. I think you're off the hook. I think okay. And thank you to everybody who's asked questions and for participating and joining us today, and for all of the other times you joined in for the last 7 talks. There's some links in the chat for those who have tuned in live to the YouTube channel for the talks that were recorded. And for anybody watching this later, you've probably already got those links. That's where you are at the moment. Yeah, just to end by mentioning the roundtable discussion on Friday at 2 p.m. GMT. We'll be sending around a link to Zoom for that to happen. So do look out for that in your inboxes. And for anybody who'd like to participate. And end by thanking Jansen. Thank you so much for wrapping everything up with a wonderful talk and really useful. Actually, just to wrap up myself and to mention, for anybody wanting to do a project like this themselves, where would you recommend they start to gather this kind of information, like inclusive, being like centering inclusivity and that kind of stuff?
There's a lot of good stuff. You know, I didn't always give them the most favorable treatment, but the Seven paper and the Sutherland paper really do have some nice guidelines. There's a paper by Sutherland et al. In Methods in Ecology and Evolution that is kind of a step-by-step guideline for how to do this type of work. We are hoping to write the reflective piece on how this project ran, but you know, realistically, that's a year away from being accessible.
Cool. We'll look forward to that. Thank you for that for now. I think somebody was trying to break into my office here, so I'm going to have to go. But thank you all so much for tuning in and for ending it with such a lovely note. Thank you, Jansen.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you, Jansen. That was wonderful.